Hey, welcome everybody to the Northwest Risk Spring webinar on invasive dune grasses and coastal habitat restoration in a changing climate. We're really excited to have two fantastic speakers with us today. And before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of Zoom housekeeping things. So on the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's an option for chat. And those chats will come directly to the hosts and panelists of the webinar. So throughout the talks and after the talks, please feel free to add any questions that you may have to those chats, and we'll go through those during our moderated question and answer sessions. There's also an option on the bottom of your screen for reactions. So you can use that reactions button during the talks or during the question and answer to give to kind of interact and give your reactions toward what's being said. Yeah, so we've got some thumbs up coming in there. And then if you are finding those distracting, you also have the option to change how you can view those reactions on your own screen. And so you can either hide those or you can turn down the intensity of those reactions as well. So my name is Emily. I'm the Northwest Risk Network Coordinator. I'm going to be moderating our talks today. And we're going to start here with Dr. Sally Hacker from Oregon State University. And we're really excited to have Sally here to talk about research on invasive dune grasses and coastal services. And I'm not going to keep Sally from talking any longer, so I'm going to go ahead and get my screen turned off. And Sally, if you're ready to go ahead and share screen, you can do so now.
Great, thank you. Can everyone see my screen? Good. So thanks, Emily, and also Northwest Risk for inviting me here today to talk about Pacific Northwest dunes. I'm a professor at Oregon State University and have been studying dunes for almost 20 years now. And I haven't been doing that alone. I have a team of people that I've worked with. One of my collaborators, Peter Ruggiero, is also a professor here at OSU. He's a coastal geomorphologist. I'm obviously a coastal ecologist. And then we have an amazing group of grad students who over the years have done a lot of the work that I'm going to talk to you about today. So I want to make sure to give a shout out to them. And we've also been funded, lucky to be funded by a number of agencies, including NSF, EPA, NOAA, Army Corps, U.S. Army Corps, and also Sea Grant. So thanks for their support as well. So I like to kind of simplistically think about Pacific Northwest dunes having kind of a past, a present, and hopefully a future. And so I want to kind of organize my talk around the past and present some research that is important, I think, for the present, and then talk about how we can use that research to look at the future. So Pacific Northwest dunes are actually a very abundant ecosystem. So they make up about 50% of the Oregon and Washington coastline, about 20% of the California coastline. And actually the largest dune sheet in North America occurs in Oregon. And this was one of the inspirations. This large dune sheet was actually one of the inspirations for Frank Herbert, who wrote Dune, which is, obviously a very popular book, but also now a popular movie. And so he visited these dunes in the 1950s and was inspired to write Dune because of what he saw in terms of the ecology of this region. So the past, I want to talk a little bit about the past and what dunes used to look like prior to, let's say, the early 1900s. And they were actually very sparsely vegetated ecosystems. And they featured a sort of dynamic, open, shifting sand environment. Not a lot of plants capturing sand, so sand would move its way inland. And so these were very immense, large areas of sand. that were very dynamic. And the native plant dune communities included a diversity of species that thrived under this kind of open shifting sand environment. But I should say that we actually know very little about the sort of natural history of what dunes used to look like 100 to 150 years ago. We just lack the kind of scientific information about these systems, which makes restoring them rather difficult. So in the early 1900s, as Europeans were settling the coast, they were really hindered by this kind of sand mobility issue. So, shifting sand environments, sand was shifting, making its way, inundating houses, inundating roads, crossing over, train tracks, etc. So this is quite a big problem in terms of trying to settle these areas. And so a decision was made in the early 1900s to plant native beach grasses. And this was a Pacific coast-wide effort to systematically kind of stabilize this shifting sand environment. And the planting of these non-native beach grasses occurred over decades, but the grasses themselves also spread very easily. And so they were able to colonize pretty much all the dunes from, let's say, Mexico to Canada by the late 1950s. How this sort of process, the stabilization, worked was that vegetation, captures sand, it slows down sand, blowing sand that's coming up from the beach. That sand gets deposited around the grasses. They actually are stimulated by that deposition, and they grow as a consequence of that sand deposition. And then as they grow bigger, obviously they're going to capture more sand. So there's this sort of positive feedback between vegetation and sand that ultimately ends up building what we call foredunes, which are these hills of sand behind the beach. And we know from books that were written, in particular this book by William Cooper, which was published in 1958, which is a compendium of maps that were generated of Oregon and Washington dunes in the 1940s, that actually by the 1940s, beach grasses were pretty prevalent along the entire coast of Oregon and Washington. We also know that from aerial photos. So you can see here some aerial photos of dunes and the kind of landscape level transformation that occurred by the 1950s. So in the upper left, you can see a picture of Pacific City, Oregon, lots of sand, lots of open areas. By 2020, that picture below, you can see that there is a lot of green. So there's a lot of foredune that has been built, a lot of grasses, also a lot of development. So coastal development then was allowed to happen kind of unrestricted because of the planting of these beach grasses. In this other picture on the right, you can see Umpqua Dunes, Oregon. This is that large dune sheet that I mentioned earlier. And on that photo, you can see a deflation plain, which is a very, very large vegetated area that, and then the foredune in front of it, both of which did not exist in this area before 1940. So there was a lot of vegetation and kind of stabilization that had occurred by the 1950s. And of course, what that led to was kind of shifting ecosystem services. So foredunes, provide important coastal services, especially in the age of climate change. So we're thinking about, how these foredunes capture and stabilize shifting sand. So they're very good at that. They also serve as barriers from extreme storms, from sea level rise, from tsunamis, which are all real threats in our region. They prevent beach erosion compared to, let's say, riprap or hard structures, thus really promoting beach recreation, which is a very important ecosystem service, worldwide, but especially in our region. And they also can increase coastal carbon sequestration. So one of the things that we've recently been working on is measuring the actual amount of carbon that's being stored in these dunes, and it's quite a bit of carbon. So from the perspective of sort of sequestering CO2, these dunes can be important from that perspective as well. But of course, there are trade-offs, and the major trade-off is that at a landscape level, we've shifted the ecosystem from what was once this very shifting sand dominated kind of ecosystem to one that is highly vegetated. And what that has done is caused declines in some native species, including the western snowy plover, which we'll talk about next. It's also increased the invasion of other non-native species. For example, Scotch broom and gorse are really huge management problems, especially in Southern Oregon. It's allowed development of what we would historically call hazardous coastal areas. So areas that are normally hazardous are now able to be developed because of these foredune structures. And then it can also foredunes can interfere with coastal viewsheds and also the cultural values that people care about along our coast. So that's sort of the past. What I want to do now is talk about the present. So this is kind of the age of beach grasses, the age of what do we do about beach grasses, i.e. restoration, and also climate change. So our research has really focused on the ecology of invaded and restored dunes. We've tried to study both types of dunes. I'm going to mostly talk about invaded dunes because I know that Will is going to talk about restored dunes quite a bit. So I'll leave that to him. But I did want to mention what restoration really involves. And restoration involves, trying to restore the native species. So really, removing the grasses, actually grading down the foredune, so the hills of sand, and trying to recreate this kind of shifting sand environment. And this kind of restoration has actually occurred kind of systematically for western snowy plovers, which are federally listed, ESA listed, threatened species. And so there are a number of what we call HRAs, or habitat restoration areas, along the Oregon and Washington coast that are receiving these kinds of restoration efforts to try to recover the plovers, but also, I think more recently, a focus on trying to recover some of the native endemic plant species that have had, maybe less attention, but are receiving more attention today. So what about the invaded dunes? I kind of glossed over the fact that actually there were two species of beach grasses that were systematically planted in the early 1900s. The first one was European beach grass, which is the Mothel arenaria. It's obviously native to Europe. It was introduced in the early 1900s and then has spread along the Pacific coast from, like I said, Mexico all the way up into actually Alaska now. The second species is the American beach grass, which is native to the East Coast of the US and also the Great Lakes. and Ammophila breviligulata is its name. It was introduced in the 1930s, especially near the Columbia River. And then it spread and actually spread very quickly and dominated most of the dunes in the northern region. So from northern Oregon up into northern Washington and now up into actually British Columbia. So Ammophila breviligulata and Ammophila arenaria both occur on our coast. They overlap in their range from northern Oregon into Washington. Ammophila breviligulata, however, does not occur in southern Oregon or in California. So there are two different species, and that has kind of created a situation in which there are some consequences for that. One of the consequences is the effect of these species on dune shape. And so the two different species actually have produced dunes of different shapes. And that's in part due to some things I'll talk about in a minute. But essentially, the European beach grass is associated with dunes that are taller and narrower compared to the American beach grass, which is associated with dunes that are shorter and wider. And so if you were to go out and measure dune heights along the coast in this area of overlap between these two species, what you would find is this kind of association where one species is creating dunes that are taller and narrower than the other species. So this can, of course, have implications in terms of coastal protection, in terms of flooding and overtopping of dunes. And through a series of field and experimental studies, both kind of field surveys along the coast, studies that we've done in the wind tunnel at Hinsdale, which is at OSU, and then also common garden experiments that we've conducted at Hatfield Marine Science Center. We know that the differences that we see in terms of dune shape are determined by both sand supply, so how much sand is making its way to the dune, to the foredune, and also the functional morphology and growth form of these two different species of beach grasses. And so this sort of interaction between sand supply and species that are growing on the dunes can determine the shape of those dunes, which is, obviously an important management consideration. The other consequence, which was kind of blindsided us and is still kind of a very, very active area of research for us right now, is the fact that the two beach grasses actually hybridized with each other. So they reproduced with each other in this area, obviously, where they're overlapping in their range. And they produced a hybrid beach grass. And we discovered this hybrid about 10 years ago because it looked pretty different than the two other species. And so we were sort of curious about what was happening with it. Ultimately ended up doing a lot of genetic work on the hybrid and determined that in fact it is a hybrid. It has chromosomes from each parent, and that it is actually spreading along the coast. So we've done surveys of the hybrid and trying to look at its kind of range and abundance. And even the limited surveys that we've done, we've found more than 300 hybrid individuals along the northern Washington and northern Oregon coastline. So it's much more abundant than we had originally thought. We've done now experiments to look at its growth and its competitive ability compared to both of its parent species. And and it turns out, in fact, the hybrid has the highest growth rate of the three species and is actually competitively dominant over its parent species. And so the hybrid can actually grow twice as fast as its parent species, just to give you some concept of how fast growing this new species is. And it can obviously outcompete its parents. So the hybrid, so what we do is we're sort of hypothesizing that the traits of the hybrid will allow it to spread and sort of widely dominate over time, resulting in what we think will be taller and wider dunes that are potentially less diverse compared to the parent species. And so this research is ongoing, and obviously we're going to look for more hybrid, and we actually have a community science project going where we're trying to get people to look for the hybrid and use iNaturalist to report on any kind of sightings that they find of the hybrid. Okay, well, what about the future? So the future really, I think, involves how do we manage these coastal dune systems, and how do we manage them for multiple ecosystem services, not just one service, i.e. coastal protection, but multiple services, including looking at, including managing for native biodiversity. And so what we've now done is kind of move into the realm of trying to determine the value of these ecosystem services. And the work that we're doing is really determining kind of the biophysical, but also the economic value of a suite of these ecosystem services. We're doing this work with Dr. Steve Dundas, who's an applied economist. And we're looking at a number of different ecosystem services of dunes, from coastal protection, recreation and beach access, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and aesthetics and cultural values. And how we're valuing these ecosystem services is through a few different methods. One is making biophysical measurements, so trying to understand, for example, how do dunes attenuate waves? How do dunes promote species diversity? How do dunes, how much carbon is stored in dunes? We also use what we call revealed preference methods, which are, housing and recreation choices that people make along the coast. And then we can also use what we call stated preference methods, which are public surveys of people's willingness to pay for, let's say, conservation of dunes or the coastal protective services of dunes. Once we have these values, the suite of values, we can integrate them into land use models. And so what we're doing is integrating the ecosystem service values that we have into these land use models, and then engaging with coastal communities to kind of co-develop optimal policy scenarios. So, trying to understand where should we place restoration? Where should we place housing developments? How should we sort of manage these different decision units, if you will, along the coastline to best optimize the ecosystem services that the coast is providing us. So I'm going to end there. I've gone over maybe a little bit long, but if you have any questions or thoughts, I'd be happy to answer them either now or after Will finishes his portion of the talk.
Thanks so much, Sally. We did have a few questions come in for you over the chat, and we can work through those now. So the first question was one of our attendees was curious about what has prevented the American beach grass from extending its range further south.
Yeah, great question. I think part of it is probably related to currents. So the current system, the spread of these beach grasses can happen through ocean currents. And the predominant ocean currents that are important are coming from the south to the north. And so we believe that the northern regions have been invaded by Ammophila breviligulata, mostly because those beaches have received seeds and fragments of the beach grasses due to the movement of currents. But it's a
Thank you.
great question, and we don't know why more southern regions haven't been kind of slowly invaded.
All right, we've got another question here for you. It is about, so how much overlap is there in the space between coastal meadows supporting the Oregon silver spot butterfly and the dunes being restored for snowy plover? And kind of this question about, are we, losing one to have the other?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to leave that question to Will.
Sure.
Because yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So there was another question about just kind of how to distinguish between the two invasive beach grasses.
Yeah. So there's a tissue on the grass at the elbow of the grass. So where the grass blade meets the stem, there's a little tissue. It's called a ligule. And on Ammophila arenaria, the European beach grass, that tissue is about 1 centimeter long. And then on the American beach grass, the Ammophila brevi, so little ligule, breviligulata, that is about 1 millimeter long. So if you can find the tissue, then you can tell the difference right away. And it turns out that the hybrid has a ligule that is half the length of Ammophila arenaria. So it's right intermediate between the two different species. And that's in fact how we initially discovered the hybrid.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's see. So we have another question for you here, asking if you could share more about your work with Dr. Steve Dundas and how might anchoring a dune value in a monetary-based value system drive unintended consequences on access and prioritization of profitability over dune health?
Yeah, so I think the ecosystem services that we're valuing are also ones that are not traditionally valued. And so our philosophy, I guess, is that if services are going to be valued based on monetary value, which, land is valued in that way, that it's important to value those things that in a monetary way that we have not traditionally valued. So for example, biodiversity. What's the value of biodiversity? What are people willing to pay to have a diverse dune or to have a restored dune? And so our philosophy has been to try to put those values on equal footing with the more traditional valuation process of monetary values for land use.
All right, I think we're going to try one more question before we move on to the next talk. So this question is, are there any known potential biocontrol agents that go after the two grasses? And if so, do they also work on the hybrid species?
Yeah, there's none that we know of now. And the grasses aren't really disturbed or eaten by much. I mean, elk, I think, would be the major consumer of the grasses. And even elk kind of avoid the beach grasses because they're really high in silica, and so they're not that great to eat. Interestingly, actually the native grass that we have is eaten a lot by elk. And so that kind of goes in the opposite direction to what, what we would want. But yeah, to try to, sort of biocontrol the grasses, nobody has really come up with any kind of solution for that.
Is that an area of active research that you know of, or have folks not really gone
Not an
down that
area.
road?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's really not, and I think, I worked on Spartina invasions about 20 years ago, and there was, efforts to try to use biocontrol on those, and that also didn't work very well. So I think that's kind of a road that's, harder to do research on. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sally. If we have
Thank you.
time, we're going to bring Sally back on for some questions at the end. But for now, we are going to go over and transition to our next talk on the dune restoration aspect of this. So I'd like to introduce you all to Will Ritchie from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And Will, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and share your screen and start in on your talk.
Okay, am I showing my screen?
Not yet, no. All right, that looks good.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. I'm William Ritchie with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at Willapa National Wildlife Refuge. I'd like to tell you a little bit about an intriguing place where I've spent some time. One of the first encounters with this unique land was many years ago while I was conducting a survey for an elusive shorebird, the western snowy plover. It was shortly after the discovery here of a pink sand robina, which was a plant thought to have been extirpated from Washington for 50 years. I was walking a survey transect through an area recently cleared of Ammophila, and I had seen it in situ, but not in, and I basically, I wasn't exactly sure what it looked like, but I started to recognize a few scattered plants and carefully navigated around them. Soon I found it difficult not to trammel upon it, and it was everywhere. Today, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the place and the stewardship that we've been undertaking to aid in resetting the ecosystem functions of an altered landscape. Ledbetter Point lies at the northern end of the Long Beach or North Beach Peninsula, where Willapa Bay empties into the Pacific Ocean on the southwest Washington coast. It's about 28 miles north of the Columbia River Delta. It's an area of constant change and movement influenced by currents, wind, and waves, where long shore currents transport sediment and wind sculpts the land. The photo on the lower right shows Ledbetter Point in 1966, shortly before it was added to the refuge. You take note of the extent of the forest and the location of Grassy Island up to the right on the upper part of the photo. And relative to the tip of the peninsula in this and the next series of photos. The black line depicts the southern refuge boundary, and so you can see my pointer here. This is Grassy Island, and this was the tip of the peninsula in 1966. cursor is acting funky here. Okay. So this series of photos that I'll kind of refer you to Grassy Island here and the tip of the peninsula. Again, Grassy Island in the foreground and the peninsula in the center of the photo. And then again here more recently in 2011, Grassy Island down here, and the tip up to the north. Okay, I'll try this. This is a recent photo taken and shows Grassy Island solidly connected to the peninsula now. And the forest edge has extended from near the southern refuge boundary northward towards the tip, and right about in here. And now it's possible to drive over a half a mile beyond where we could drive during a low tide just 4 years ago. Our efforts aim to minimize impacts of beach grass on rare species and ecosystem functions, and to provide resiliency from the effects of sea level rise. Before the arrival of Ammophila, the beach consisted of rolling hummock and swale type sparsely vegetated dunes, as Sally had mentioned earlier. Beach grass was not intentionally planted here as it was elsewhere, but it naturalized from a material that moved up through the ocean currents. Note the lack of trees and the presence of the native Elamus mollis dune grass in these photos. As the invasive beach grass narrows the beach and increases the elevation of dunes, tides overwash the outer beach more frequently, making it unsuitable for nesting. As sea levels rise, less beach habitat will be available and predation pressures will be concentrated on the remaining habitat. Some portions of the refuge outer beach that formerly attracted nesting plovers are now unusable during most of the breeding season. On the southern end of the refuge, we've had to move in the nesting area closure boundary landward by 38 meters over the past 8 years. In anticipation that some birds will need to move inland, this project allows for coastal dune ecosystem retreat, thus providing habitat resiliency in response to a changing climate. Without reducing the spread of non-native beach grass, the densely vegetated uplands allow for an encroachment of trees and woody shrubs, such as Scotch broom and gorse, that further impair the ecosystem. And on this photo on the lower left, you can see where the shore pine, which is a native species, but establishes once the beach grass keeps the sand from moving. That shoreline has moved back as the tides increase and undercuts the bank, where causing the trees to fall out on the beach and making the entire beach unusable for plovers and larks. Our methods use integrated pest management approach to restore the natural open beach characteristics. Chemical and mechanical techniques are employed to reduce the beach grass cover by removing above ground leaves and stems and the dense rhizomatous root mat at a scale large enough to allow for wind-driven sand movement. The first acre that was cleared at Ledbetter Point occurred in 2002. Pink sand robina and streaked hornwort nests were found in the habitat restoration area in 2006. The restoration exceeded 100 acres in size by 2008. In 2010, connectivity between the HRA and the outer beach began to be addressed. And then work on the adjacent Ledbetter Point State Park began in 2014. By 2019, we began large-scale restoration of over 100 acres per year. Judicious use of herbicide is a proven means to control beach grass at scale. We found that aerial herbicide application is most cost-effective and efficient than ground-based application techniques. Bulldozing is used to remove the above-ground plant material and approximately the upper 2 feet of roots. Tilling is then followed to slow the beach grass regrowth, and spreading shell hash when it's available typically occurs in year 3 to 4, and that's done to help provide a little bit of stability to the sand surface before some of the native plants establish, and it also provides crypsis for nesting birds. Maintenance involves a more targeted treatment where we are harrowing to control resprouting of grass where shell was previously spread. Isolated beach grass clumps too large to hand pull are mechanically removed. And also prescribed burning was recently tested by Washington State Parks as a method to reduce some of the above ground patch. Hand weeding occurs adjacent to native perennial plants, and a 200-meter wide zone of encroaching shore pine is being removed adjacent to the restoration area to discourage predator conflicts with nesting larks and plovers. From the first acre of beach cleared in 2002, the project has progressed as resources and funds are available. In this view, we can see the Mafla created secondary inner dune, which was formerly the edge of the outer, the transition between the interior and the outer beach, and the current primary or outer dune, and our efforts to establish a continuous connection in the swale between. Notice the cuts through the secondary dune where corridors ran between the initial habitat restoration area and the outer beach. So what we were finding is these kind of artificial corridors that connected the original restoration area with the outer beach were arbitrary, and they didn't allow the birds to move naturally between the two locations where they mostly feed on the outer beach and nest. Some of the nests were interior. And then also the predators would be targeting the plovers as they move between the two locations in those corridors. Plover site scale habitat characteristics include little to no vegetation, and the vegetation that's present is usually short stature. There's little cover of non-native beach grasses, and materials such as wood, debris, shells, and other objects range from 0 to 26%. Habitat objectives are similar for larks. They require low stature native vegetation, slightly higher relative cover values than for plovers, and less than about 10% tree and shrub cover. We monitor a series of variables using results to adaptively adjust our treatments to improve efficacy. Breeding and wintering surveys assess adult population size and trends of the threatened and endangered birds that inhabit the area. We also monitor nest success, reproductive success, and survival. This figure depicts the streaked hornmark abundance at Ledbetter Point, where the solid line and left axis indicates the maximum male bark count, which is the metric for breeding pairs. Since detectability of the males is much greater than the females, we use a maximum male count to improve abundance. The estimated number of breeding territories is indicated on the right axis in the period of blue diamonds. And the outlier kind of up there around 2014, 15. I'm not sure what, I think that was probably a little higher than normal, and we slightly changed the way we interpret determine breeding territories that more closely follows reality now. But because detections tend to be a little harder, we're using some new techniques that I'm not going to go into now, but if you're interested, I'll be giving another talk on this in another couple of weeks. The snowy plover picture is a little bit more complicated, but basically sparsely vegetated beaches attract nesting birds and support the most productive sites. So in this graphic, from the top to the bottom shows the nesting population trends in Washington here on the top. And then at Empire, Graveyard Spit, Midway Beach, Ledbetter Point, Palos Spit, and Connor Creek. Plovers nesting at the top three sites likely act as a meta population. Those are the three that are clustered around the entrance to Little Bob Bay. The gap in the data is attributed to the coronavirus pandemic, when we wanted to get out and do surveys at all the sites. We track management actions and discrete invasive plant locations using mobile device apps in a program developed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Inventory and Monitoring Program. And here you can see a screenshot from one of our mobile devices indicating areas where mechanical work and some of the herbicide treatments have occurred. An effective and practical vegetation sampling method is being revised to collect data on recolonization of native plants and to track reinvasion of non-natives. And we don't expect to be able to eliminate beachgrass from Ledbetter Point, but our goal is to limit its spread and reduce the need for intensive maintenance. Seed banks are in the soil are biodiversity reservoirs. Native seeds are adapted to harsh coastal environments and often are durable and can remain dormant for decades to survive where they face regular disturbances. We've undertaken some native plantings in the restoration area, but a majority of the native plant recolonization thus far has been a result of natural regeneration. On the upper left photo there, you can see some of the pink sand rubina naturally regenerated in the restoration area. And that is a state endangered plant in Washington State. And Ledbetter Point, as I mentioned earlier, is the first place that it was detected after 50 years of being gone, basically. So biodiversity has increased and nature rebounds, or single species focus has morphed into a holistic ecosystem level stewardship, leading to improved ecological integrity. I now have much more diverse array of organisms to grab my attention than I did on those surveys years ago. And we work with many partners on this project, but I'd like to give a special shout out to our very dedicated and skilled refuge equipment operators. Without them, this work would not be nearly as substantial or effective. I think I finally made it through my cursor for my there we go. That's like that.
Thanks so much, Will. That was great. We did have some questions come in for you, but I wanted to start first with, if you remember, Sally kind of punted a question to you that came up earlier. And so the first question that I want to pose to you is this one about how much overlap there is in space between the coastal meadows supporting Oregon silver spot butterfly and the dunes being restored, and whether or not there's some trade-off involved there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do actually work on Oregon silver spot butterfly habitat, coastal habitat restoration as well, coastal prairies. Those tend to be a little bit more inland in some of the stabilized dune areas. So there isn't really a lot of overlap that we see between those two areas. We have looked at the potential for having some overlap with our beach restoration once the native plants established, but really we haven't done a lot of experimentation with how well the larval host plant will establish in those really near shore areas that are being restored for clovers and logs. We do have some here at the refuge, one of our coastal prairie restoration sites. We did an experiment to look at different methods of habitat treatments to develop habitat.
Well, you
and one of them
froze
was,
for me.
okay, am I back? Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Okay, yeah, I apologize, my internet connection is a little weak here. But we did do an experiment where we sand burial, we mimicked sand burial to look at the natural disturbance regime. And the violets do fairly well, not as good as in some of the other areas, but I don't think there's a problem with one usurping the other. I think they're kind of discreetly separated.
All right. So we have a couple of questions here about the treatments themselves. So I'm going to kind of put them in here together. So the first is about what herbicide you're using and what time of year that treatment occurs. And then the other is about the prescribed burning. So if there were any potential complications that arose from that new method of prescribed burning.
Great question. So the herbicide that we use is Invasive. It's a broad spectrum herbicide that has a little bit of a retention in the soil so that it helps treat some of the root, the below ground portions of the Ammophila. And that is typically, we apply that at the end of the breeding season. So we're usually doing it in October because we have to wait until all the nesting birds have kind of cleared the area. Probably would be slightly more effective if we had done it or could do it in a more earlier in the growing season in the summer, but we're limited on when we can do that because of the nesting birds. The prescribed burning is just really new. We just tried it this year with state parks. Mainly the thought there is that it's reducing the amount of thatch and above ground stems, so that the area had been treated with herbicide first, killed the beach grass, and then we did prescribed burn. And that's mainly to remove or reduce the amount of material so that when we go in and do the mechanical work, it's easier to clear the area. But it's still very, very new, and it's just a small scale test of it this past March. So one of the things we have to, it's paramount that we don't disturb the area while the birds are actively using it. So we're limited to, all our work is basically from about October through March. And so it's the most difficult time to work out there, but we just have to do it because that's the right thing to do.
Excellent. Thank you, Will. I think we have a couple more questions here, and I was wondering, Sally, if you wouldn't mind coming back on. I have a question that can kind of go for both of you. I'm kind of wondering about both of your perspectives here. And so, Will, on your side, there's a question about whether there's been work to look at how the landscape might change in the area that you're managing with climate change, and how you expect your restoration efforts to, kind of like be affected by those projections. And Sally, I was wondering if you could also kind of comment a little bit more on, the projection work that's being done with climate and how that affects, what you are expecting to see in the future on these landscapes. So Will, do you want to start? Yeah.
I'll go first. Yeah. So what we're expecting based on what we're starting to see on the southern end of the refuge is the outer beach is becoming narrower, and as I said, especially in the early part of the breeding season, the higher tides are overwashing pretty much the entire beach and causing the foredune to cut in an escarpment, basically. And so there is virtually no opportunity for the birds to nest on that portion of the beach. And so by removing some of the beach grass inland from there, we're preventing we're opening the space to sand movement. We're also preventing the shore pine from growing right to the shoreline, like I showed in that one photo, and then basically making the entire beach unusable to the ground nesting birds. So we're just allowing that, anticipating that we are, when we're already seeing effects of climate change, but that'll allow that habitat to migrate inland a little bit by providing the open sand and removing some of those stabilized features that are there now because of the beach grass.
All right, excellent. And before you jump in, Sally, would you mind putting the name of the herbicide that you all used in the chat for everyone? All right, thanks. All right, now Sally.
Yeah, I would just add, in terms of thinking about restoration areas and sea level rise, I think there is sort of a silver lining in the fact that some of these systems that we're restoring naturally were overwashed in the past. And that actually, through the overwash of those systems, can decrease the spread of the beach grasses because they do not do well with seawater. And so thinking about, restoration and sea level rise, I think one of the aspects of that is that we can actually use some of that erosion and overwash to restore these systems naturally to what they were. on the flip side, the areas that are, you know, highly populated by people, going in, knocking down the dunes, and, you know, basically trying to restore that kind of overwash system, you know, is not something that, you know, is advised, right? So I think, you know, it's all about planning, and it's all about the context in which we're doing the management and thinking about, you know, how sea level rise and increasing storms are going to affect, you know, particular places along the coast that vary in terms of their, you know, sand supply and geomorphology.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you both so much for joining us today and giving these fantastic talks. We're going to go ahead and wrap up this webinar. So the webinar was recorded. Folks will be able to view that online later. And I want to thank you both again. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks, everyone.